is the new Audi Q5 Sportback, and it's the kind of car for people who want a high-riding SUV but still hold on to that dream of one day owning a sleek sports car. Now, cars like this tend to get a lot of flack because you're essentially spending more for less. But the Q5 Sportback is here to prove the naysayers wrong. Sort of. Is it worth £2.5 more than a regular Q5? Well, today we're going to find out. But before I get into the review, you know what to do. Hit the like button and subscribe for more awesome videos just like this one. This is the first time Audi has made a Q5 Sportback, but you can actually trace its underpinnings back to 2017 when the new Q5 was announced. Now, the Q5 SUV was actually facelifted last year, and along with it came this Q5 Sportback. So the car you essentially see here is a coupe-like version of the facelifted Q5. Yes. Now, the facelift introduced a bigger, wider grille that looks a lot glitzier than the old one. Although if you go for one of the top spec cars like the Vorsprung, you can get it in gloss black. We also have a new headlight design and a lightly revised front bumper. But the big change on the Sportback is, of course, the Sportback roofline, which is sleeker and more coupe-like. Now, although it looks like it's going to really impact those in the back, the actual height of the car is only 2mm shorter than the regular SUV. And to complete the look, we have this small rear wing at the back, which probably provides some downforce. Not that you're going to be fast enough to really test it out. And you probably think that the rear visibility would be quite poor because the rear window is so sloped, but it's actually really easy to see out the back because we've got a nice big rear window. But the thing I find really cool about not just the Sportback, but also the regular Q5, is that you can spec OLED tail lights. So not only do they have a higher contrast compared to a regular tail light, but they're also really versatile. So it means that you can have different light signatures for your Q5 to stand out amongst all the regular versions. Time to address the elephant in the room. How much space do we have in the back of the Q5 Sportback? Well, 510 litres, which, if you know your Q5s, is only 10 litres less than the SUV version. And compared to its rivals, it kind of sits between the BMW X4, which is a little bit bigger, and the Mercedes GLC Coupe, which is a little bit smaller. It's really not that much of a compromise. The only thing you need to bear in mind, though, is that because you have that sloping rear window, it does have a slightly awkward shape to it. So if you're in the business of selling washing machines and refrigerators, then you'll probably want to go for the regular SUV. But for everybody else, the Sportback will be just fine. There are lots of engines for me to remember. I mean, plenty of engines to choose from. Now, the range kicks off with a 2-litre diesel engine producing 201 brake horsepower, and that's badged the 40. And above that is a 2-litre petrol producing 261 brake horsepower, and that's the 45, which makes loads of sense. Anyway, both come with quattro all-wheel drive systems and 7-speed dual-clutch gearboxes. If you want an engine that's not going to melt the polar ice caps quite as quickly, then you'll want to go for the TFSI-E. Now, that car is a plug-in hybrid, meaning you can plug it into a charger and drive on electric energy alone for up to 38 miles. Now, that's available in two different forms. It starts off with the 50, which produces 295 brake horsepower, and then there's the 55, which produces 362. And no, I'm still not done, because there's the SQ5, which uses a 3-litre diesel producing 336 brake horsepower. Now, that's not quite as powerful as the PHEV, but it does go from 0 to 62 in 5.1 seconds. 0.2 seconds faster than the plug-in car. As I touched on earlier, the Q5 Sportback does carry a small premium over the regular SUV. So prices start at £45,000, making the Sportback around £2.5 more expensive than the regular SUV. Now, I know what most people are going to say, you're basically paying more money for a smaller boot, but you also pay more money for something like a 911 GT3, and it's stripped out inside. Of course, you can find plenty of new and used deals on Q5s and Sportbacks over at yesauto.com. And there's a really cool feature that we've got on our app where you can actually compare the two cars. So if you're struggling to figure out which one to go for, you can put them side by side. But even in this S-Line, which is a relatively entry-level car, it's just above the base spec Sport, you still feel like you're in a car that is premium enough to warrant that kind of money. These S-Line sport seats, for instance, come with Audi's Dynamica faux suede, which looks sporty, yet is incredibly comfortable. There's metal trim around the dashboard and centre console, which contrasts nicely with a gloss black panel around the drive selector. The wheel is perfect, far thinner than what you get on a BMW, and it's lovely to hold. Physical buttons for the climate controls are the cherry on the cake, as they're far more intuitive to use on the road compared to frustrating touch panels. The only frustrating part about the new Q5 is that the old model had a dial down here which you could use to manipulate the infotainment screen, but that's no longer on the car. You've just got this kind of pointless tray, which I guess is a good place to store the car keys. The cabin, though, is packed with features. We've got Audi's MMI virtual cockpit, which is not only razor sharp, but is crammed full of information. In the centre of the dashboard, we've got the infotainment screen, which is crystal clear and very responsive, but it's not as neatly integrated as something like the new Audi A3. And in this car, we've got the Bang & Olufsen sound system, which sounds awesome. Now, if you go further up the range, you'll have things like different trim options and a head-up display. But even in this S-Line model, there are some odd omissions, like we don't have wireless charging, even though we have wireless Apple CarPlay, and you also don't get adaptive cruise control as standard. I was in the new Nissan Qashqai a few days ago, and it was included in the very base model, which was like 25 grand. Remember earlier when I said that the roofline was about 2mm lower compared to a Q5? Well, headroom is actually down by about 6mm, which is a whopping that much. So does it affect headroom? Not really. I'm just under 6 foot, and if I lean back, it could get a little bit tight if I was 6 foot and over, but I don't really know how many people actually sit in cars like this. You're usually a bit more upright like that. And if that was the case, then yeah, plenty of headroom. Same goes for legroom. You can actually move this bench forwards and backwards a bit. I've got it as far back as I can. The driver's seat's in my position, and legroom is pretty good. I think if you were, again, 6 foot or a bit over, it might start to feel a little bit cramped, but there is a bit more space kind of sculpted in to the back of the seats. There are a couple of things worth noting, though. The first thing is the roof actually does come down quite low, so when you get in and out of the car, you might have to duck down a little bit. And the other thing that's a little bit bizarre is the transmission tunnel is massive. So if you are sat in the middle, it shouldn't be too bad, but you're going to have to spread your legs out a bit because that is one of the most pronounced I've seen in a new car. So with a name like Sportback, the Q5 Sportback should be pretty sporty, right? Well, it's brisk, but I don't think the word briskback really has the same ring to it as Sportback. So at the moment I'm in the 45, which is the petrol car, and on paper it's actually pretty quick. You've got a 0 to 60 time of around 6.1 seconds, 261 brake horsepower to play with, all-wheel drive, a really snappy 7-speed dual clutch gearbox. It ticks a lot of boxes. But a cool thing about the petrol engine is that it comes with a 12-volt mild hybrid system, which isn't quite as punchy as something like a 48-volt mild hybrid system, which comes on a lot of cars today, but it is still enough to give you just a little bit of a kick when you need it. Half the time, though, you won't really notice it's there. The only time that it will kind of grab your attention is when you lift off the accelerator and your MPG bar will show that it's charging up the battery. One of the options we do have, though, is that there are lots of different driver modes to go into. So if we want to sporty things up, we can go into dynamic, which gives the steering a little bit more weight and also sharpens up the throttle response a little bit. But in the UK, this S-Line model comes with passive dampers. So that means that when I put it into dynamic mode,
it's not going to feel stiffer and it's not going to hunker down to the ground. The dynamic mode is really just there to overtake a slower car, or if you fancy the steering to feel a little bit heavier. There is actually an individual mode though, so if you go into that, you will be able to, let's say, increase the weight of the steering without having the rest of the car in its sporty setting. And while we don't have any kind of adaptive dampers here, it doesn't mean the car feels like it's wallowing in the corners. Sure, we can't adjust the ride height or stiffen things up a bit, but it already feels like a very well engineered car. So even when I'm going through a twisty set of turns or on a really bumpy road like I am now, it just seems to handle it with ease. And the 2-litre engine that I've got in front of me, I've just given it full beans coming up onto a motorway, and it's really quiet. You barely hear it revving even when it is. I was in a Kia Sorento earlier this week, and you can actually watch my review by clicking the link in the top right hand corner, and that just felt really quite noisy when you put your foot down. But this thing just feels nice and refined. Now, there are lots of bits of driving tech that you can go for, but as standard, it's a little bit Spartan. So in this S-Line model, the only real thing that I have is cruise control, not adaptive cruise control, which is a little bit strange because you'll find a lot of this car's cheaper rivals, and I mean considerably cheaper, are starting to offer that as standard. But I'm going to let Audi off the hook on this one, because this Q5, its underpinnings do go back several years. It is a slightly older car, but I would expect perhaps the next generation of Q5 and Q5 Sportback to just have a bit more standard kit when it comes to that semi-autonomous driving stuff, because it really does help. As a whole though, I think the Q5 Sportback seems to occupy a bit of a middle ground. I think as something to drive, a BMW X4 is going to be a little bit more engaging, but the ride's going to be a bit firmer. And if you go for something like a Mercedes GLC Coupe, you're going to have a car that on the surface feels a little bit more luxurious. But I think the Audi is a little bit tougher. It feels like it's been put together better. And comparing this to the regular Q5, I think it's pretty straightforward. If you want something that's a bit more practical, you go for the regular Q5. If you want something that's a little bit sportier, you go for the Sportback. There's really not a lot else to choose between them.
So the Q5 Sportback really does feel like it's worth its £45,000 price tag, because it doesn't feel that compromised compared to the regular Q5 SUV. Sure, a BMW X4 is going to drive a bit better, and the Mercedes GLC Coupe will be a little bit more luxurious on the inside, but the Audi kind of serves as the perfect middle ground, which is kind of what Audis are really good at doing anyway. Of course, if you've got your eyes on a Q5, but that £45,000 price tag just seems a bit too high, go head over to yesauto.com, because we've got plenty of deals on new and used Audi Q5s.